Let's talk about next week's budget, what to expect and what we need. As Becky said, Philip Hammond had planned a relatively quiet budget so as not to excite or upset any of his backbench colleagues before the major Brexit votes. And the Brexit votes were originally planned, as you know, for a couple of weeks after the budget. So the Tories moved the budget day to the Monday, a much quieter parliamentary and news day. Plus, I also suspect his public relations advisors were dreading the prospect of a budget on Halloween itself. A trick-or-treat budget was just too much of a reminder of past Hammond fiascos, basically. Then what happened? What's interesting, what happened at party conference is exactly as Becky said, to the absolute surprise and consternation of the Chancellor and his officials, Theresa May announced in her party conference speech the end of austerity. Well, this budget will show us whether she's true to her word or not. Is it a trick or is it a treat? More trick than treat, I suspect, next week. But it would be interesting to know what the Prime Minister meant by the end of austerity. But more importantly, I think, given that the PM and the Chancellor obviously rarely consult each other, it would be even more important and more interesting to know what the Chancellor interprets as the end of austerity now. So far, from both the PM and the Chancellor, all we've had are a few random announcements on the NHS and social care funding, plus lifting the housing cap and a fuel freeze. Then there have been hints of, well, Brexit jam tomorrow. Now, the Office of Budget Responsibility has recalculated its tax receipt estimates and has given the Chancellor enough to cover much of his NHS announcement. Plus, we expect there'll be some funding for social care announced and maybe more pressure on local authorities to increase their council taxes to cover it. And we hear that as a result of, well, our campaigning on universal credit, which is likely to force him to find some funds to only limit some of the damage the universal credit rollout is perpetrating on our communities. And I think Hammond will try and argue that this is also some grand spreadsheet plan. No, it isn't. The reality is that over the summer, after Labour's campaigning, naked panic set in amongst the Tory backbenchers on a number of fronts, including the rollout of universal credit and the impact on their constituents, the collapse of social care, and yes, the growing prospect now of a worse than ever NHS winter crisis. So going back to their constituencies, Conservative backbenchers realise that people they've just had enough of austerity. They've had enough. So for most of their constituents, it's been all pain and yet very little gain. So the result was that by party conference time, Theresa May realised she couldn't resist her backbenchers on two fronts, both Brexit and austerity. And I think she also asked herself, why should she take the political hit for Philip Hammond's ideological obsession with neoliberal austerity? Because this is the Chancellor, if you recall, she'd planned to sack anyway if she'd secured a majority at the last election, and someone whom she feels has been undermining her ever since. So with a bit of chutzpah, which actually I quite admire, Mrs. May threw the architect of austerity, the man who in the days when the Tories were in opposition designed the austerity programme, well, she literally threw him under the proverbial bus with a unilateral announcement of the end of austerity. And the result has been that in the weeks since Tory party conference, well, the lights have been burning very late into the night at the Treasury, as the quiet budget gets dumped and the officials have to dress up existing announcements and a few off-the-shelf stunts into something much more grandiose. The pretense of a big budget really has become a trick-or-treat budget. The problem for Philip Hammond is that he knows that the economy is hardly growing, and the chaotic handling of the Brexit negotiations is putting what little economic growth that there is in peril. Now, the OBR recalculation of tax receipts will assist him in paying for some of the promises already announced, but not much further. and certainly not enough to end austerity. And actually, they're little more than accountancy adjustment exercises anyway. Hammond will try and claim that the OBR's recalculation of tax receipts is all part of a grand plan, the result of the Tories' management of the economy and corporation tax cuts in particular. But as his own Treasury officials and the IMF have repeatedly pointed out to him, there's no link between cuts in corporation taxes and increased tax receipts. To link the two is to mistake correlation for causation. So much of the reason for the increased corporation tax receipts is the growth in super profits made by many corporations. So by any standard, the management of the economy by the Tories over the last 8 years has been a catastrophic failure. Austerity was never going to work. The inevitable result is the slowest recovery, as Becky said, for centuries since Napoleonic times. And the UK is the only economy where, when limited growth returned, wages were still falling. As virtually every sound economist advised, cutting public spending as you go into a recession was only going to deepen and prolong the recession. Of course, we'll hear from Hammond and the Tories trying to beef up their record of economic management. They'll boast about reducing the deficit. Well, let's remember, we were promised the deficit would be eliminated by 2015, not 2018. The reality is that the Tories haven't sorted the deficit. They've simply shifted it onto the shoulders of NHS managers, head teachers, school governing bodies, local councillors, and yes, police chiefs, as we heard from the report this morning. When Hammond also boasts about reducing the debt to GDP ratio, remember that under the Tories, the country's debt has almost doubled. It's now a massive nearly £1.8 trillion. And again, some of that debt has shifted onto families as household debt stands at record levels. Last year, households spent on average £900 more than they earned, with the poorest households spending the most relative to their income. And as a result, British households are more indebted than those in, well, the US, France, Germany, Italy or Japan, with unsecured debt at £300 billion. No economy will thrive without stable investment, leading to consistent growth, high productivity, and as a result, high-level employment and good pay. According to the OBR's most recent figures, UK business investment is the lowest in the G7. Public sector investment is over £18 billion lower today than in 2010. Cuts to corporation taxes have not encouraged firms to invest. Instead, they've relied upon cheap labour whilst hoarding over £700 billion of earned income and not investing. So it's no wonder that economic growth remains so low. And because of low levels of investment, Britain is missing out on the new technological revolution. This country has the lowest rate of use of industrial robots in manufacturing in any of the OECD countries. Employment growth in tech services has crashed to its lowest level since the financial crisis. So it's also no wonder we're experiencing an ongoing productivity problem, with workers in France and Germany producing in 4 days what it takes a UK worker to produce in 5. Output per hour is 15% lower in the UK than it is in the rest of the G7. And the result is wages remain below the levels, we're told today they've reached just about levels of 2011, but 3.7% below 2008. The geographical distribution of investment is also biased. Britain is the most regionally unequal country in Europe, having 6 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe. With an ongoing current account deficit of £20 billion, we continue to rely upon what Mark Carney describes as the kindness of strangers. So recent number 11 briefings want us to think that we're witnessing a wise chancellor holding back expenditure so that the economy can cope with the economic hit that would follow from a no-deal Brexit. And that all will be well when Brexit bounce occurs after a deal is sewn up. Well, I believe the Chancellor can't distance himself from the mess this government is making of the Brexit negotiations. He's a leading member of the Cabinet's negotiating team. His failure to stand up to the fanatical no-dealers in the Cabinet and in his own party makes him as culpable as the Prime Minister for this unholy mess that's putting our economy at risk. And it's no use him trying to stand on the sidelines, throwing out the occasional statistical analysis from the Treasury, when we recall it was him who was among the first to publicly threaten a no deal with Britain, slashing taxes and becoming an offshore tax haven. And a temporary bodge of a deal to get the PM and him through the next couple of months with no permanency to the deal will not alleviate the fears of investors and business leaders. Far from a Brexit bounce, we'll see an ongoing draining of future resources from our economy. So for the immediate future, it's clear that none of the planned expenditure announcements in the budget will go anywhere near the scale needed genuinely to end austerity. The IFS has calculated that simply to halt the planned cuts in departmental spending will cost £19 billion by 2023, and a further £7 billion of welfare cuts are planned on top of this. Resolution Foundation estimated that ending the already planned austerity cuts will cost £31 billion. But the real end of austerity is also not just about halting future planned cuts. It's also about reversing the cuts inflicted on our community by the Conservatives over the last 8 years, 8 hard years of austerity. If there's to be a genuine end to austerity, well, the first step is for the Conservatives to acknowledge the scale of the hardship 8 years of Tory austerity has inflicted on our people and our communities. The Labour Party today is publishing a dossier summarising very briefly just some of the austerity measures and their impacts on our society. I just want to look at one element of the human cost of austerity, what it's meant for children and young people, something that we've raised in past budget statements and tried to secure some movement from Philip Hammond with little success. For children, there are over 4 million children living in poverty, with the Child Poverty Action Group saying another million children will be forced into poverty as a result of the universal credit rollout. Over 500 children's centres have gone already. Nearly 500 children's playgrounds have been closed and will have been closed by 2019. There are over 123,000 children in this, the 6th largest economy in the world, living in temporary accommodation, and that's been an increase of 65% since 2010. Children's services, I've raised this at the last budget and in the statement. Children's services are facing a £2 billion funding gap. Cuts to early intervention to support families, and the cuts have reached 40%, has resulted in the highest number of children being taken into care since 1985. The chair of the Local Government Association's Children's and Young Persons Board said that unless new funding is found for these services, which keep children safe from harm and the worst abuses of society, these services are now, to quote, at tipping point. For young people, the YMCA reports that spending on youth services has fallen 62% since 2010. 600 youth centres have closed. 3,500 youth workers have lost their jobs. 14,000 places for young people have gone. And the pressures on young people are immense. The average graduate coming out of university has a £50,000 debt, with the poorest graduating with debts in excess of £57,000. In work, young people between the ages of 16 and 25 are significantly more likely to be on zero-hour contracts, with 36% of all zero-hour contracts taken up by young people. The IFS describes home ownership amongst young people as having collapsed. Rough sleeping has more than doubled, rising for the 7th year in a row. And tragically, with mounting pressure, a decades-long decline in suicides amongst men has reversed since 2010, with research linking the impact of austerity to 1,000 extra deaths, an additional 30 to 40,000 suicide attempts amongst young men since 2010. Future generations are also being put at risk by this government's policies. The IPCC report gave us all the stark warning of the threat of climate change if we do not act now and act decisively. And yet analysis of the government's planned infrastructure investments, the infrastructure pipeline, shows that there's a 95% decline in planned investment in renewables from 2017 to 2020. The Environmental Audit Committee inquiry heard expert evidence attributing the decline directly to government policy, including removing subsidies and, yes, privatising the Green Investment Bank. Investment in renewable energy fell by 56% last year, following cuts to the essential subsidies to that sector. It's the biggest, the UK's is the biggest fall in the world. Annual clean energy investment is now the lowest it's been since 2008. Just three examples of what austerity has meant. We've set out some of it within the dossier itself. So the conclusion we reach from the Labour Party is that we need real action to end and reverse austerity. 8 years of Tory austerity have undermined much of the social fabric of our society, and it's putting our children's future at risk. Faced with this scale of damage inflicted on our community, we need decisive action to end and reverse austerity, not some vague promises for the future and a few financial conjuring tricks. Last year in the general election, we set out the principles upon which a modern economy can be successfully managed so that we can invest in our public services, grow our economy, and enable people to share fairly in the prosperity that we will then create. These basic principles of our approach still apply. They include the introduction of a fair taxation system to provide the investment that we need in our public services, an investment programme to grow our economy, harnessing through a strategic investment board and a national investment bank the expertise and talent of our finance and manufacturing sectors to grow our economy. An entrepreneurial state implementing an industrial strategy with a mission-based approach, prioritising innovation, tackling climate change, and yes, regional growth, the fair distribution of regional investment. And yes, sharing that prosperity we create by ensuring decent wages, trade union rights, representation of workers on boards, and spreading ownership within our economy. Next week's budget, and in the prospect of more confusion and chaos in government over Brexit, confirm for us the pressing need for change. We need a general election, and we need a new government. And Labour stands ready to form that government, and I stand ready to bring forward a Labour budget that will create the prosperous and fair, sustainable economic settlement that we need. And we will open the debate next week by challenging Theresa May and Philip Hammond to end austerity and to end it with decisive action in this budget. Thank you very much.